Well, along here I've been planting some trees, and because it was so dry, I did a technique which they use in hot countries, which is to dig a small hole next to each tree. It's these little holes, you can just about see them. Holes there, little hole there next to the tree. So when rain runs off down the track and runs onto this area in heavy rainfall, it get caught in these little holes and water the tree. Some of these trees were planted on slopes, and I've been watering them by hand, and if you just pour water on the slope it runs off, so having these small little dimples, which you can see here. So all these big trees I planted with a digger, and that's why all these big trees here with a digger, that's why I'm making extra effort, because obviously there's not as much root. I've also planted small little trees as well. So down here, and you can see all the little, it's maybe a bit hard to tell, you see the little holes. And it's a trick I learnt in Uganda, where we did swales, which were ditches to let the rain come in, infiltrate into the ground. I wouldn't have thought that growing up in Wales you needed these sort of techniques, but it seems to be getting dry, so it probably helps. I've also done a bit of mulching here around the trees, obviously keeps the moisture in. Need to do more of that. There's a little hawthorn on the hill there. When I water that, the water just runs straight off, and with the dimple there it's better. Also, when I dug the holes it loosened the soil up, so it meant that when it did rain it soaks in better. This has been quite gentle rain this time, but sometimes you get dry weather and then you get a massive downpour and the ground's too hard to absorb anything. Another thing which I used to see when I was working in the tropics was all the tracks used to have these drains coming off, and growing up round in West Wales, sort of 80s onwards, I never saw that, but then sort of a few years ago you started seeing on roads a lot of ditching work and running water off. This whole track's done at a slope, so the water always runs off, and if you go further up track you'll see berms where the water's taken off. And in the tropics on soil roads, every sort of 50 to 100 metres you'll see a little berm going off and the water going off to the side. And that's something which I've seen started being using here. Due to climate change we're getting more intense rain, short bursts of rain, heavy rain, lots falling in a short amount of time, which compacts the soil and runs off quickly, doesn't infiltrate, and in long dry periods. The technique is mulching with stone, and the mulching with stones will obviously slow the impact of rain hitting the ground, stop compaction, and it means the water won't evaporate, so it stays damp under there. Also stops weeds competing and taking the water. It's quite lush and green, a bit like Uganda, which is where I was a long time ago. We were planting on a hill, a bit like this I suppose. We had these ditches, and then running along the contour, which are called swales, to allow water to infiltrate, and below the swale was caliander trees, which are deep rooting trees, and they fix nitrogen, and their leaves are 70% protein or nitrogen, which would be fed to goats or laid on the soil as a fertiliser. And then below the banks there was this long tall grass growing called elephant grass, and another one was vetiver grass, and this grass, as it grows up, soil is eroded down around it, but it doesn't mind being submerged in soil, and so the roots will just, the grass once buried will actually just put up new growth, and you can actually get banks of a few metres high of vetiver grass growing up. And sorry I'm using this example here, there's nothing here, so West Wales, I'm remembering back to when I was in Uganda. But anyway, so these banks would be along the hillside, and during the heavy tropical rains it would, every 10 metres down the hill you'd have on the contour one of these swales, and it would encourage water to infiltrate into the ground, and then you had the fertiliser from the tree leaves to put on the ground, and then in between the rows of trees, which were about 10 metres apart, then you had beans and maize and other crops like that. Obviously we don't generally need to be making water infiltrate in West Wales so much, but they are doing it up in marshy areas, blocking off drains, encouraging infiltration. It reduces flooding and stuff, and so maybe these techniques are useful here as well. I also remember when I went out to Kenya, we went to a dry area called Pekot Marriage Pass, which looked like something out of one of those Wild West films. It was like Cactus Gulch, and these dry rivers, and there was a charity there who'd had tree nurseries, and they were encouraging the farmers there who had been digging holes and then planting trees next to them, big holes about the size of the bath because it was very dry there, much bigger than the ones you saw down at mine. And so in a big heavy rain it would all run off and fill up this bath size hole with water, and then that would kind of make it wet enough for these trees to grow. They also were getting dead acacia plants and putting them around these areas which were basically there was nothing growing there because it had been overgrazed because of all the pastoralists who would roam around with their cattle. But some people who lived in these villages would make a few acres, fenced off with dead acacia, and then they would actually plant a hedge as well with these holes and stuff, try and get stuff growing. And in these fenced off areas, the grass would all come back and grow about 1 metre high. And there was this funny story how it was traditional there, because there was no grass growing, it was just eroded, like semi-desert almost. It was traditional for young men to sleep outside, and only when they got married would they then go off, travel with a donkey a long way up to these hills far away, and where there was grass growing because it was wetter and cooler, and then bring the grass back, thatch a house, and then they'd move into the house with their new wives. And because there was this guy had fenced off these areas, not fenced, but made these acacia dead branch fences and kept all these other animals roaming around the plain out and got his long grasses growing. They were actually harvesting the grass and then thatching their houses, and they were able to just get their own houses without getting married, which was interesting because it meant that they didn't have to sort of, they could just forget about actually getting married. It probably, reducing population, just getting on with their lives. It was a breakthrough somehow. Something as simple as that. But it was amazing passing through these dry areas and then suddenly seeing in the middle of nowhere these sort of meadows, a bit like Little House on the Prairie, with lovely long grass, and seeing how a little small change could make a big difference. And the other thing which was interesting there was that when I left, I heard on the radio that there'd been this massive cattle raid. They'd come in and 7,000 head of cattle had been stolen, including often still the women and stuff. And they come in with their machine guns, and because the cattle owning tribes there, they sort of raid each other. The Karamojong and the Turkana cross the border and stuff into Uganda and Kampala, Uganda and Kenya, and they raid each other, the cattle. Obviously with these, if you'd had these fenced off small fields, it would have been impossible to steal 7,000 cattle, because you'd have to go into each individual field and get the cows out, whereas when it's a big plain they would literally just all move across the plain with the guns. And even though there was only less than 2% tree cover there, the Kenya army had come out with helicopters the next day, and they couldn't find these guys. They just disappeared off into the bush. Anyway, so it was interesting that this guy creating these little areas and getting grass growing again was possibly making quite profound differences with a simple technological change. Interesting charity. Here there's an example of a gentle berm in the road, so as the rain comes along here it goes out off the track. And this, I've always do this when I'm doing tracks, and it seems like obvious now, but about 20 years ago you just didn't see this. But since this heavy rain's got heavy here, people have, you see even on the highways they're doing this sort of thing. And there's another one here, and I've done these all the way up the track. There's quite a few of them, and the whole track slopes off sideways. But yeah, getting rainfall off and running off is important. Yeah, interestingly, when they ploughed this field, they used to plough it in a sort of, all the furrows used to run this way, and that meant all the muck ran out this gate down here. And I used to go through a pipe. Well, I used to wash away the track and go down the track, but there was a pipe put in, which is now gone. But anyway, that's another story. But anyway, so now then they started ploughing it the other way, and that meant all the stuff got into our springs. The springs went green. And then now I don't know whether there's been less heavy rain, but I think, well, down with it, I think they still plough it, so it still runs off more that way. But down near the spring there, I did a big bank and made sure the water goes off around the spring down, so that it's not at least flowing onto where the spring is. I suppose it relates vaguely to swales and managing runoff. And there's actually a spring down here as well. This is Cromwell's Ring, which is in there, and where Oliver Cromwell camped before he went to invade Ireland, over there. And in there's an old Iron Age fort, which not many people know about. And when the Vikings would come in from the sea, the Celts would be hiding in these forts here. They'd light a fire, send up a beacon, and you can see up into Canna Woods there's a fort up there, which from there you can then see down to the one which is down at Castell Hentis, which is the Iron Age fort, which is done up. So they all could send messages, and obviously the hills back then were a bit more bare, I suppose, and the valleys were forested, and they lived up on the hills. And you get this in Greece as well, where people lived inland to keep away from the raiders, which means you get quite a nice empty coastline. And interestingly enough, the Celtic names for places like Abergwaun, Abertavy are all just means the mouth of the river, whereas the actual names, Fishguard and Swansea and Milford Haven, are all actually Viking names. So they saw it as, the Vikings saw it as an actual place, and the Welsh, it was just the mouth of the river, and they didn't really live there, they lived up inland a bit.